going to go ahead and kick us off because there is a lot of ground to cover tonight. But welcome to Carnegie Museums from Home, members only. I'm Kara Fixie, the Assistant Director of Philanthropic Engagement and Stewardship here at Carnegie Museums of Pittsburgh. And if this is your first time joining us on Zoom, welcome. We're really excited to have you. But if you're a frequent flyer to our virtual programming, we are equally excited to have you tune in to This Is Your Brain on Money. We have a trio of incredible experts with us tonight. First off, neurosurgeon Dr. Jonathan Pace will be orienting all of us who did not go to med school to neurons and pathways and basic brain anatomy. Then from Fort Pitt Capital, financial advisor Chris Cheney will dive into how your brain is involved with making financial decisions. And then to close us out, my colleague from the Science Center, the Director of Visitor Engagement, Iwaniec, share some of her insights into creating educational content about the brain for the Science Center's visitors. And like I said, that is certainly a lot of ground to cover, so I will endeavor to make my portion as short and sweet as possible. First off, I do want to thank Fort Pitt Capital for sponsoring and for their close collaboration. I also want to thank Allegheny Health Network for their participation. And last but not least, a huge thank you to our speakers tonight for sharing both their time and expertise. I hope tonight's program inspires you to go check out the BodyWorks exhibit at the Science Center in person, and really any of the 4 museums we hope to see you wandering around very soon. If at any point during tonight's talk you have a question, feel free to click on that Q&A button at the bottom of your window, and time permitting, we'll have a short Q&A at the end. So without further ado, I will turn things over to Dr. Jonathan Pace.
All right, thank you very much. I'm really excited to be here. And as you all know, here in Pittsburgh, we're having quite the storm currently, and I lost internet connection just a moment ago, so I can't share my slides. I'm hoping you can share them for me if you still have them available.
Yes, pulling them up as we speak.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much. Well, as she's pulling that up, I just want to start off by saying thank you so much, everyone, for coming, and thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. I'm honored and very much excited for this opportunity to speak with you about the topic of that this is your brain, and this is your brain on money. I'm the first speaker. Again, I'm Jonathan Pace. I work at Allegheny Health Network in the Department of Neurosurgery. You can go to the next slide, please. Just a little bit about me. I grew up in northern Wisconsin in a small town called Minocqua. Ultimately, I ended up going to medical school in the Medical College of Wisconsin. Following medical school, I completed my training in neurosurgery residency at University Hospitals, Cleveland Medical Center. At that time, I focused on endovascular and vascular neurosurgery, as well as skull-based and general neurosurgery. I had the opportunity and the really just was very excited to be able to also obtain an MBA during my time in Cleveland at the Weatherhead School of Management. You can go to the next slide, please. I have nothing relevant to disclose for this talk. So as you may or may not know, on this day back in 1930, Clarence Birdseye, an entrepreneur, was granted a patent for his method to quick freeze food, which revolutionized the food industry. And I hope to convince you by the end of this talk that he was using his prefrontal cortex to plan that patent and really achieve that goal. Next slide, please. So why am I giving this talk? As you might know, being a surgeon, I have a passion for neuroanatomy. It is just all-encompassing in everything that we do. And I want you to see how amazing the brain is and be excited about this information and want to learn more on your own. You can go to the next slide. When you take away from this talk, really the basics of the anatomy of the brain. I have about 10 or 15 minutes to talk with you, and this is really a topic that PhDs can focus on, as you know. So I'm really going to try to condense it down and focus on the important things to take away and really add to the other speakers that will be talking after I give you the brief overview. The main things that I want you to see is that the brain is responsible for everything that we do with different pathways throughout the brain. And it's also responsible for how you think and react with regards to everything around you, as well as money. Next slide, please. So brief anatomy. There are over 86 billion neurons in the brain. Neurons are the workhorse of the brain, allowing for information to be transferred very rapidly at over 60 meters per second. And at the very top, you can see the dendrite that leads down to the cell body. And from the cell body, there's the very long axon surrounded by myelin in this diagram. That allows, again, very rapid transfer of information. It allows you to take in information from the outside world through your visual system and your auditory system and react within milliseconds to, in the case of, as we were evolving over time, responding to threats and, modern days, in sports and that sort of thing. So it's a broad network that works together. Next, glia are really the support system, and there are many different types of cells, but they all support the neurons and allow the brain to function in a very efficient manner. Next slide, please. Next, once you have the neurons individually, they connect and form many different pathways that help, again, your body to function in very fantastic ways. We'll take a look at the visual system briefly, just as it's a nice overview and simple pathway to sort of conceptualize all of this. Next, we'll look at the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex, which are more at play for both development as well as how your body functions day to day. You can go to the next slide. All right, so this is the visual pathway. And as you can see through the dot tracing through there, that is how information flows through the brain based on what you see. So what you see in the left side of your visual field, to the left of what's in front of you, hits the back part of the retina in the eye on the right side. It travels down the optic nerve to the optic chiasm, and then it branches. And part of the information goes to your brainstem, while part of it bypasses and goes back to the primary visual cortex, which is in the occipital lobe in the very back part of the brain. This allows a lot of things. One, it's just very fascinating that what you see in front of you in your eyes is interpreted in the very back of your brain. Next, with the branching pathways going to your brainstem, it allows you to, if you see a threat in front of you, to automatically move your eyes to that, as well as your auditory system playing a role as well. What you hear can trigger your eyes to move automatically. So all of the systems work together throughout evolution to help keep you safe. Again, just a very nice illustration of the different pathways in the brain and how they work. You can go to the next slide, please. All right, so next we have the limbic system. In this graphic, it shows a lot of the deep structures in the brain, some of which are involved in the limbic system. The limbic system is really responsible for four main things that your body does for you. Maintaining homeostasis, or just allowing your body to function in a normal capacity. Your sense of smell is actually part of the limbic system. Next, memory and then emotions are controlled by the limbic system. This all developed early on in the course of evolution, with that part of the brain being termed the archicortex and paleocortex, as you'd think paleontology being old. So again, the oldest parts of the brain. A good example of how this works is if you've ever eaten something and it made you sick. The next time you're around that type of food and you smell it, your sense of olfaction goes through there, through the olfactory cortex, and interacts with the amygdala, and you might have this overwhelming sense of nausea or just not feeling well. That is your limbic system, again, keeping you safe. it was fight, flight, again, intense emotions, fear and anger. This all helps to, protect you. As far as money goes, this might be related to, impulsivity, like wanting to do something, not thinking it through. I don't want to step on Chris's toes, but again, just that rapid sort of reflexive interactions with your outside environment. The limbic system has connections throughout the brain, both to the prefrontal cortex and back, as we'll see shortly, and then as well as down to the brainstem, to again, allow your body to rapidly interact with the environment. You can go to the next slide, please. All right, next we have the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex developed later on in evolution, and it's what sort of elevates humans up above other mammals and primates and vertebrates. It allows for executive function. And what that really means is deeper thinking about things, abstract thought, planning, judgment, delayed gratification, many other functions, but the prefrontal cortex is responsible for that. It might allow you to think, even if you really want to buy 100 lottery tickets, to sit back and think, and maybe you want to spend that money on something else that might be a better investment for you or lead to more long-lasting pleasure for you as far as the prefrontal cortex goes. I hope the video is playing. I can't tell on my side. You might have to press play, but anyways, the prefrontal cortex is in the front part of the brain, the frontal lobe, and it's the anterior part of the frontal lobe. If the video doesn't work, that's okay, but that's where we stand with the prefrontal cortex. And there are bidirectional connections with the prefrontal cortex throughout the brain, both to the limbic system, the amygdala, and the hippocampus specifically for the emotions and for the memory. The prefrontal cortex, in interacting with the hippocampus, allows for working memory, and ultimately with sleep can lead towards more long-lasting memory. And then further, there are interactions and connections with the association cortex throughout the rest of the brain, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. You can go to the next slide. What this really means for us is that the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex work together to help with our judgment and actions. They are directly connected. They're more of a check and balance system, is how I would phrase it. The prefrontal cortex allows us to sit back, think, reflect, and then make an appropriate judgment. Conversely, the limbic system is more for, again, fight or flight, rapid actions in response to things that are thoughts that are really brought about in a heightened sense of emotion. Again, they perform different but complementary tasks. You can go to the next slide, please. And with that, I will pass it over to Chris. Thank you very much for your attention. I apologize for the technical difficulties, but that's my wife, Liz, and our dog, Scout. My email is there. We'll be around later for the question and answer session at the end, but feel free to reach out with me with any questions or if you'd like to discuss things further. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doctor. Let's hope this brings it up. Here we go. Hi, my name is Chris Cheney. I am a senior financial advisor with Fort Pitt Capital Group. At Fort Pitt, we help our clients make the most of their money. We have offices in Pittsburgh, Harrisburg, and Naples, Florida. But the people we help are all across the country. Whether you're a business owner or a retiree or planning to retire or already enjoying life, we know that providing for today and planning for tomorrow are important. If you'd like to talk more about what we're exploring this evening or like to schedule some time to see how we can help you make the most of your money, I am happy to talk at any time. We just have a fun topic tonight. I hope it helps you. We're delighted to collaborate with Amanda, with Dr. Pace, and bring this program to you. Our discussion tonight is, as Dr. Pace has explained, is how the brain affects or shapes your financial decisions. Now, I don't like making mistakes. I don't know anyone who does. They can be costly. I do learn a lot from them, more than from my successes. And often they're the price of growth. But on the whole, I'd like to minimize them if I can. I'm looking to optimize results, not just get learning experiences. So how do we get those results? Well, it turns out I'm not alone in that concern. Over the last few decades, there's been growing interest and research into how the brain affects decision-making. As it turns out, we're not just irrational, we're predictably irrational. This is a great book, by the way, by Dan Ariely. Really recommend it. This irrationality is the result of reflexive perceptions and reactions which may have worked extremely well for our ancient ancestors, but which have limits when you apply them to modern decision-making. The result of this research has been a real insight that can make a material difference in your life. Now, as financial advisors, we are eager to learn from these findings in order to help our clients make better decisions and make more money. So let's take a look at your brain, at least as far as it applies to finances. And again, I'm going to kind of want to touch base with what Dr. Pace talked about. In terms of financial behavior, there are popular books on this subject that have come out and they've really flourished over the last decade. Typically, they divide the brain into the two key areas that the doctor talked about. You've got the prefrontal cortex, also called the executive function, the C system in some books, system 2, critical thinking. Then you have the limbic system, or what some people call the lizard brain, the X system, system 1, intuitive thinking. So the limbic system is ancient and remarkably efficient, takes care of all of those autonomic processes of your body and maybe the source of your gut reaction. You experience this when you have a compelling urge to do something, eat, drink, sleep. It's the source of key survival responses of fight or flight. It is at root a survival system and as such is incredibly powerful, and it can easily override its much younger sibling, the prefrontal cortex, which developed much later. So the second system developed, as far as we can tell, to help us navigate complex social systems. Dr. Jonathan Haidt, he's a research social psychologist. He knows that this part of the brain is especially interesting because it doesn't appear to be dedicated to any specific system or tasks. It can think, plan, make new associations, regulate emotions, and generate creative solutions. It is, in short, miraculous. It's also, in evolutionary terms, new. To use computer terms, it's still in beta test and a little bit buggy. So this is not just the result of its limits, though. It's often a result of its strengths, of its habitual way of processing. In this way, it's a bit like Marge Simpson, who at a moment of stress when the family's driving, reaches behind her and slaps Bart. Bart is shocked and says, "What was that for?" And she responds, "Well, in times of trouble, you got to go with what you know." Our brains are a lot like that. Brain science has been helping us understand exactly why. And the interaction between the two systems seems to have a lot to do with it. There we go. Dr. Haidt also points out that this has actually been a long-standing concern. It's the tension between these two systems of thought that occupied a lot of early philosophic thought. Plato expressed these systems in metaphorical terms, with one part being seen as a chariot and the other part being seen as a driver. Now, this image may imply a little too much rational control over the mind. We don't have metaphorical reins. Dr. Haidt recommends the analogy of an elephant and its rider as a little bit more accurate. It makes sense to me. A rider can coax an elephant, can nudge it, but it can only truly guide it when it's docile. If it's not, well, that's when things get interesting. We see this vividly on display with a phenomenon called loss aversion. Studies show people fear loss much more than they value gain. And in fact, we are twice as responsive to fear as we are to greed, twice as reactive to threats as we are to opportunities. This makes sense. If you missed a great meal one day, your ancestors could find another one tomorrow. If they missed a predator, well, that's the end of the story. Fear is powerful. Marketers know this, politicians know this, and they both use it. This experience becomes an issue for investors when the markets experience sharp downturns. Loss aversion can move us to take flight, resulting in some very destructive behaviors and choices, like selling low. It's often been remarked that a stock market sale is the only one that people don't like. In my experience, this is absolutely true. One reason this behavior may occur is that the elephant takes over. It's called a panic for a reason. Scientifically, the experience behind it is something called flooding. Fascinating dynamic. Dr. John Gottman, a research and clinical psychologist, explains how during periods of distress, the brain floods. It's as if the elephant takes over and the rider just shuts down. Our survival mechanism overwhelms the executive functions of our brain. And when that happens, We simply cannot think clearly at all. It's as if the brain becomes captive to survival tunnel vision. While this sort of survival response may work well with a genuine threat, it's deeply counterproductive for investors. At such times, it's critical to de-escalate, to get the elephant under control. So how do you do that? If you're not Dr. Dolittle, how do you talk to the elephant? Well, there are a variety of things that you need to consider when you're trying to manage the elephant. Number one, when the elephant rampages, and we're talking it's out of control, when you are flooded, the key is HALT. HALT is an acronym. Never make an important decision when you are too hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, HALT. This applies to whenever your brain is sliding into survival mode. Hold this a way to remind yourself, stop. Bad decision ahead, do not make any important decisions right now. When you're in the midst of flooding, the only solution that you have is to de-escalate. Now, this requires walking away. Focusing on something completely unrelated to the instigating topic. Here's where Thomas Jefferson's idea of counting to 10 is the right idea. Your mind needs to focus on something completely different than the subject. Step away, literally and figuratively. This is the only way to get the elephant to calm down. Once the elephant is calm, talk it out. Talk to somebody who's not in your head. It is often our assumptions and our tendency to project outcomes based on those assumptions that escalate our emotions, that can help to accelerate the flooding. I've seen this so many, many times. It's important to talk with your advisor when you feel distressed. In fact, during periods of particularly acute stress, we call our clients. We want to talk to them to help them think through the current but passing storm. Ultimately, Dr. Haidt notes that there are 3 proven ways to talk to the elephant, at least when it's not stampeding. The first way, if you really want to challenge and change the underlying assumptions that frame your behavior, you want to do this through something called CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. You examine your assumptions, you consciously reframe them in a more accurate and productive fashion, and then you begin to approach life in a very productive and much less de-escalated way. The second method is one that he identifies that has long-term benefits on multiple levels. It's meditation. Meditation and prayer foster many things, including your ability for detachment, which is absolutely critical to managing or avoiding flooding. His third approach, so you know, is Prozac, which goes way beyond the scope of my part of the discussion. I will defer that to the doctor. And these approaches, however, the approach is always the same. Let me go back here. The approach is always the same. We want to try to de-escalate. We want to try to calm down. We want to get to a point where we are open. We're able to take a detached frame of mind that supports a rational, open, and potentially creative approach, the kind that permits us and is able to make good choices. I kind of jumped ahead here. And the reason is when the elephant can be a problem, it may surprise you to know that the rider can be a problem too. It has its own issues. So we want to take a look at what the brain and the rider, the executive function, actually does. And the doctor touched on this as well. One of the key things that it does is it makes maps. You may wonder how that applies. Now, we're not just talking about terrain, but a map of what's important and what isn't. A value map, as it were. This ability to make meaningful maps, maps of meaning, is the foundation of some vital aspects of our existence. These maps inform multiple levels of our understanding. If you metaphorically were to extend a value map over time, it becomes a narrative, a story. Narratives are very much maps about how to live. Extend those stories further to address the big picture, and the maps become belief systems. All belief systems embody and instantiate a hierarchy of values, providing aspirational guidance, what we should strive for, what we should avoid, and thus they help us to assess the choices that we face. This processing of valuing is a built-in requirement. We reflexively value, we reflexively select. This is, as it were, a biological necessity. So doctor talked about the eyes, the way it's connected to everything in your brain. Well, your eye, for instance, simply cannot take everything in. Your eye has a very small field which provides very high resolution and a much larger field that is fairly low resolution. By the way, it's generally true for a lot of your senses, a little more focused. This high resolution allows you to identify key details so that you can focus on what's important. As a result, you pay very little or no attention to what is marginal. This experience can be obvious in the wild where threats might exist, but it applies pretty much everywhere. When you walk into a room, your focus provides high resolution on the thing that you deem important. Perhaps it's the speaker, might be the environment if it's distinctive, or maybe some of the attendees. The rest of the room is pretty much ignored. This selective focus can have some pretty curious results. You might have heard about this. It's absolutely fascinating. In a famous test, participants were told to watch a group of people passing a basketball. Some were wearing white shirts, others were wearing black shirts. They were told to count the number of passes between the people wearing white shirts. Then the researcher asked if they saw the gorilla. A gorilla actually walked through the middle of the group and waved its arms. As it turns out, about half did not. When shown the clip again, the group claimed that the researcher had used a different clip. They did not see a gorilla walk into the middle of the group, wave its arms. Well, you talk about selective focus. So when they watched it again, the interesting thing is the people did see the gorilla, but they missed the fact that the curtain behind it changed colors and the player in black had left the floor. If you look at the upper right-hand corner, you see the actual woman in black stepping backwards. She disappears from the frame. In short, we see what we're looking for, and often we don't see what we aren't looking for. This is just a reflection of the fact that our focus is limited and it's selective. And the easiest thing to focus on, actually the thing that we do focus on oftentimes, is the easiest thing to focus on. And there's a good reason for that as well. Ironically, this reminds me of an old research joke. Yes, they actually do exist. A policeman sees a man searching for something and asks what he lost. The man says, "I lost a quarter." Big money in this time. This is back in the Depression. After a few minutes, the policeman asks if he's sure he lost it here. And the man replies, "No, a couple blocks away." The policeman asks him, "Why are you searching here?" The man replies, "Well, the light's better here." This is called the street lighting effect, and it was recognized as an issue for researchers long ago. Our focus can sometimes be limited to what is easiest to see or what has been highlighted for us. And one thing that naturally highlights our attention is whatever just happened. This is called recency bias. Recency bias is extremely common phenomenon in the investment world. You see, whatever just happened is the most vivid for us. It sets the table for our focus. It's the most current context, and it feels the most relevant. It hasn't yet receded from our attention like old news. Recency bias leads us to overemphasize and overvalue the most recent information or trends. That may be why history tends to repeat itself. We just keep forgetting the old lessons. When the investment herd, what we call the market, pursues the latest and hottest trend, we always hear the same thing over and over again. This time is different. This is the trend you need to join, except that it's never different. This is just the siren call of myopic recency bias. The current catalyst, whatever the new shiny object of the moment is yes, it's brand new for sure, but the behavior is the same every time. And this regularly induces investors to buy what is popular and thus expensive and sell what is down and thus cheap. It's exactly the opposite of what we should be doing, buying low and selling high. But that requires going against the crowd, which is really tough. So touch on that more later, but the tendency is to emphasize recent events or information as a starting point to compare it to something else. And that relates to another dynamic called anchoring. So anchoring is also built in. You see, we can't know how to assess something without a reference. We can't know how to value a thing in isolation. Our brain naturally seeks out reference against which to compare and evaluate so we can determine how much, how dangerous, how big, how far, how fast, and so on. We need a benchmark, a landmark, some criteria, a North Star. We need an anchor. And marketers know that we need this in order to be able to make a decision, so they help us. For instance, a restaurant may have a very expensive dish on the menu that very few people ever order. So why do they keep it there? Well, it serves as an anchor for comparison. The restaurant knows that most folks are likely to pick the second most expensive item, not the first. This is the item they actually want to sell, and it works. In fact, price is another thing we use to gauge value. Studies show that a pill costing $2 is more effective than the same one costing 10 cents, even when both are just sugar. This seems to be the same with stocks. An expensive or hot stock seems to have more value, which leads us to overvalue what it's really worth. During the dot-com crash in the late 90s and early 2000s, many analysts continued to support sky-high valuations. even though the conclusion of Y2K would put a hard stop to tech purchases. And there were clearly hints that things were getting out of control, including people using credit cards to buy stocks. Now, if you're paying interest rates of 20% or more to buy stocks, that assumes that the stocks are going to blow past that cost. This is a sure sign that things have gotten out of control. We've lost sight of risk. So why didn't they see the all too evident warning signs? Confirmation bias. We look for evidence to support our map. This is natural. It can be distressing to have no roadmap, no direction. We hate to be disoriented. And so we seek the comfort of finding evidence to shore up what we already believe. Now, there's nothing wrong with looking for data that supports my view. The problem is in neglecting or dismissing evidence that might challenge it. In so doing, we create our own blind spots. The quote, misattributed to Mark Twain, applies here. It ain't what you don't know that gets you in trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. And when it comes to investing, this kind of blindness is dangerous. In the market, as with driving, the most dangerous crashes occur in your blind spots. Unfortunately, when we become anxious, we tend to choose comfort over carefulness, and so we seek out those voices that support or confirm our views. This leads to another reinforcing bias that continues to push us in the same direction, the herding bias. We are deeply social creatures, and many of our capabilities evolve to navigate social systems. We want social support. We're built for it. We actually need it. See, while we're dismissive about adolescent vulnerability to peer pressure, we also experience anxiety when we stand apart from the group or the crowd. This is a survival mechanism, since an isolated human was at risk and often not long for this world. Now, one little side note, by the way, the cartoon works, but my point has nothing to do with the media or banks, just saying. So we look at our social cues, anchoring for support, confirmation bias of our views, and the result is herding. Or in market terms, bubbles and panics. We see this often, and their concern remains perpetual once we've been through one. So here's where the confluence of biases, anchoring, confirmation bias, and herding all come together to create drama. Whether they're tulip bulbs, which was a thing in the 1600s, it actually was a thing, or tech stocks in the 90s, or mortgages and CDOs in 2008 and 9, the reason for the bubble may change, but the behavior behind them is always the same. All of these biases may be compelling, and for a while, they do seem to work, but eventually they run up against reality expressed in the quote that if something can't go on forever, it won't. And so bubbles pop. And when they do, the fall can be frightening. The 2008 crash saw the S&P drop 57% from peak to trough. Panic selling ensued, the elephants took over. And one aspect that can magnify this experience is something I call projection. Now, projection is not this psychological defense mechanism. There is something called projection. That's not what I'm referring to. In the literature, this would be something a little more akin to something called an empathy gap. An empathy gap is where you fail to appreciate the temporary nature of our current state, which is why you should not go shopping when you're hungry. Projecting for our purposes is a little more ballistic. It's imagining a trajectory into the future based on the current moment. So projecting a trajectory works in the wild, but it's not so helpful now. You see, here's how this works. When things are good, we imagine that things will always be good. We can't imagine otherwise. And so we project a rosy future. How many newlywed couples imagine that they will end up among the divorce statistics? Turns out none of them. They can't imagine a change of that magnitude. Conversely, when we experience the stress or grief, we can't imagine that things will change. We project a future that's dark, bleak, hopeless, painful. And in so doing, we unwittingly terrorize ourselves with an imagined future. We succumb to what Senator John McCain meant as a joke. It's always darkest just before it turns pitch black. In short, one of the worst things we can do is project anything into the future at such a heightened moment. It leads us to absolutize the current moment and forget that this state is temporary. Projecting more of the same only escalates our emotions, which produces the flooding that I mentioned, which in turn can lead to a reaction that we would never choose in the light of day. People do this in markets too. Buying when it's high because they don't want to miss out, they're sure it will go higher, or selling when the market is low because they're terrified that the market will go to zero. In both cases, they project a future which escalates their emotions, narrows their ability to think, and leads them to react. So we have amplified behavior, being motivated by an imagined future that will actually never happen. Why is this so? Why will it never happen? Well, because projected futures fail to take into account one thing that we humans do really well. We adapt. The market, the economy, all those very smart people running those very successful businesses will adapt, and often quickly. In short, projection imagines a future in which change doesn't happen, which isn't a thing. So you see, in the investing world as in the physical world, the sun will rise again. Something new and compelling will emerge. Just a little reframing can make this really clear. So take a look at this chart. It turns out that the worst day in the market is the best day for the long-term investor. The best day. The day that you desperately want to jump out of stocks is the same day that you should jump in. In retrospect, it's the best day to be invested if you want outsized returns. Again, the only sale people hate is when the market is on sale. This goes back to risk aversion, our bias to be highly sensitive to fear, and it can cause us to make some terrible choices. So putting together everything we've seen of these behavioral biases, putting it together in the financial world to make it work for us, how do we do that? What's the best way to serve us? Well, the way we take advantage of these insights and behavioral biases is, first of all, develop a plan in the light of day. It's critical. You have to do this when you're calm and able to think clearly and know what your goals are. So it's best to do it in, as I said, a detached and calm environment. This plan should include a few things. It needs to include key metrics to let you know that you're on your path to your goal, a clear, rational buy discipline, a clear, consistent sell discipline for both your winners and your losers. And it needs to be tailored to your specific needs, circumstances, situation, goals, and concerns. I would add one note at this point, and it's important to keep in mind. Recognize and accept that all time-tested investment strategies work over time, but none of them work all the time. At best, they work about 7 out of 10 times. So you need to hold the course. Let's go back here. You need to hold the course during those times where it doesn't work. It will turn around. Otherwise, you'll end up chasing returns, which is the surefire way to consistently lose money. So you base your plan on the norm with provisions for the exception. And you want to predefine your goals and objectives. Changing them midstream will only guarantee that they will look like that stream, which tends to be at the most heightened moment, no matter what direction that stream is going. As I noted before, you also really want to learn to talk to the elephant. These techniques can really help. When they don't work, talk to your advisor. There are many, many other biases that work together to help interfere or help you make mistakes or decisions that are not helpful, all of which we're subject, but I hope this gives you a taste for the fascinating insights that we can gain from studying brain development to make better decisions and a lot more money. In our practice, we're very focused on helping clients do the right thing. And we deal with these biases regularly. One of our greatest sources of satisfaction is to hear a client we've worked with through all the ups and downs in the market tell us how happy they are, that they've achieved so much more than they ever imagined. In the same way, we are absolutely delighted to partner with Amanda and with Dr. Pace to bring these insights to you. We hope you find them as interesting and insightful and useful as we do. Now, I do want to mention that we have a number of webinars that are coming up. They may be of interest to you. We will continue to add more regularly. In September, we will be discussing charitable giving with the Carnegie. We're very excited about this. Wonderful, wonderful webinar. We also have a program on special needs planning. And something very much in line with the insights discussed here, how we choose stocks. In November, we'll be revisiting charitable giving strategies since this will be front of mind at that time. This is a great way to explore the opportunities that can benefit you and provide support to important nonprofits like the Carnegie Science Center. So please look at our website, and when you can, register for the webinar of interest to you. It's been my absolute pleasure to have a chance to spend this time with you. If you have any questions or would like to discuss anything we presented here, please give us a call. I thank you for your time.
Great. Hello, everyone. I'm Amanda Iwaniec with the Carnegie Science Center, and I'm very excited to share with you a little bit about our museum and what we do for the visitors that come every day. So I'm the director. I've been with the museum for about 16 years now, and I'm heavily involved with the program development that we offer, not only in our demonstration theater department, but I've collaborated with our exhibits team to bring cutting edge exhibits to our museum as well. One of the things that we like to focus on whenever we're thinking of exhibit design or show development is what are we educating our visitors on? And there is so many interesting topics that we can and do cover. In 2014, with partnership from Allegheny Health Network, we were able to transform one of our demonstration theater spaces into a space that evolved with content. So it started out as a kitchen theater where we focused about the nutrition and health awareness around food, to broadening that scope to talk about the human body. And what's really great about programs and exhibits at the Science Center is that we relate it back to the people that are coming into the museum. We want it to make sense. We want it to be fun and engaging, and we want you to leave with this desire and spark to be curious and learn more. So in 2014, we opened our Body Stage Theater, and our live demonstration theaters, we take the content and bring it to life. So our shows are about 20 minutes long, and they vary with that focus and content. And one show that we created in 2018 was Brain Power. We had an intern, we have a really robust intern and volunteer program, and we had an intern that's goal was to help us to think about what programs are we missing? What content do we really want to hit upon? And she was really interested in the brain. And so through the process of creating an outline and different demos, we tested things on the exhibit floor to see, what do our visitors like? What are they interested in? A lot of times topics are really interesting, but how do you translate that to a fourth grader, a kindergartner, a senior who's retired? And so by taking those experiments out onto the floor, we were able to create a show that was engaging and interesting, and also fit our niche into what we like to do in our programs. So our show Brain Power, what is one of my favorite things, is that we actually talk about the 4 different lobes of the brain. And so this is where I opted for no PowerPoint because I like audience participation. In our shows, we actually encourage people to come up on stage or do a lot of audience participation in the show. So everybody ready? Hold up your hands. Excellent. So our 4 parts of the brain that we talk about throughout the show is the frontal lobe. So go ahead and move your hands and place it. Yep. So that's where your frontal lobe would be. Then we have your parietal lobe, your temporal lobe, and your occipital lobe. So as we're talking and doing demonstrations, we keep focusing back on the different parts of the brain and kind of what those different parts are responsible for. Now, the brain is super complex. We could have Dr. Pace and Chris talk about the brain for hours. But in 20 minutes, what are the basic things that we want to cover? So, we always bring it back to those key points, making that science make sense, but also making sure that we're hitting those educational standards that a 4th grader, for instance, would be learning in school. We want them to take that back and use that in their future explorations. So I have one more experiment for you to do. And so everybody hold up your right hand. There we go. And I'd like you to draw a figure 6. Just trace it in the air. Okay. Now, what I'd like you to do is take your right hand and your right foot and trace a 6 with both of them at the same time. Are you ready? All right, now raise your hand if that was really easy and you did it. Raise your hand if you're like, no, that felt really awkward and it didn't really make sense. So we have our 2 halves of the brain, and your left side is responsible for controlling things on your right side of the body and vice versa. So when you're tracing both things with your hand, your brain is having trouble making those connections to actually trace them both in the same direction. Your leg tends to go counterclockwise, your hand's going clockwise. But if you take your right hand and your left foot and do the same experiment, you're able to do that in this easily, both going the same direction. So it's instances like that we, bring science to life. We have the audience participate and learn kind of what the main functions of that brain are, and why it's relative to you. So yeah, and I would highly recommend coming to all of our shows in our demonstration theaters. They're really engaging in bringing that science to life and help to get everyone excited to learn more.
Thank you to all of our speakers. I think I finally know the reason why I spend so much money when I go to Trader Joe's. All right, so at this time, feel free to click on that Q&A box and let us know what your questions are. And I'm our first one, and these are open to any combination of our speakers tonight. So feel free to jump in if you have some insights to share. So our first question is, can you discuss what is happening in your brain while gambling?
So most therapists, for instance, who deal with addiction, and whenever you're dealing with something that has a powerful stimulus, the Buddhists have a saying, which is, don't sell intoxicants to the young. And the idea is that you don't want to provide something that has an incredibly powerful reinforcing effect to feed people who don't have a high degree of self-discipline or self-emotional regulation. But when you are gambling, just like when you are shopping, for instance, you can have a tremendous endorphin release when you're successful. One of the reasons it starts to become addictive, and I'm not sure that's exactly the question, but that's sort of what happens. When you're gambling, you've got that tension, that anxiety, that focus. And then as soon as you win, you've got the tremendous release of the endorphins, and that can be tremendously addicting, but it's definitely an emotional cycle. Part of it is the fact that we're game playing animals and we love to play games. That's not necessarily addicting, it's just delightful. But the other part is the fact that you do have a very powerful endorphin release that when you go through that, you may want to get it again. And it doesn't matter whether it's a coin or food or a drink or a picture or whatever. They all sort of hit that same spot in the brain. Doc, anything that you might want to add to that?
Yeah, no, that's a great summary. Yeah, the dopamine release that you're talking about, the endorphins, there are many receptors in the brain, the pleasure centers, and it is a very powerful positive reinforcement. Like you said, if you win that coin flip, you want to do it again. If you're winning money, you want to do it again. If you're eating great food, you want to eat more of it. So it's, sugar can be like that. Alcohol, they talk about cocaine. Cocaine inhibits the reuptake of dopamine. So cocaine can be highly addictive for people for that reason, because of that dopamine release and that pleasure centers in the brain responding to that. So it's all related, as you said.
I think one thing I'll amplify on top of that is they actually did a longitudinal study where they took a number of preschoolers and they left them in a room and said, don't eat the marshmallow. The preschoolers who showed the high level of emotional regulation were able to not eat the marshmallow, went on to achieve considerably more academic and professional success than the preschoolers who didn't. So emotional regulation, the ability to sort of manage those periods, those heightened states of emotion, becomes incredibly important in terms of long-term success. Part of it, as the doctor alluded to earlier, is the ability to defer gratification, the ability to invest yourself without necessarily an immediate reward, key and critical to long-term success. What we also noticed from the experiment as well, though, was, or what I've read, is that when you've been through this, discipline is like a muscle. And so when you've actually exercised discipline, one thing you want to do is keep in mind is to give yourself a treat afterwards. Go easy on yourself. It's kind of like a hard workout at the gym. You need to relax and recover. What they noticed is the people who exercised tremendous discipline with the marshmallows then became super susceptible to temptation after that. They sort of exhausted themselves. So it's like a muscle. You build it up over time. You've got to recover. Just an extra thought.
And to connect that back to another museum that isn't represented tonight, the Carnegie Museum of Natural History, check out a really interesting blog post by our curator of mollusks, Tim Pierce. He wrote a little something about the cuttlefish, because as I understand, recently the cuttlefish passed the marshmallow test and a few animals that were able to do. All right, our next question is, Could damage to the prefrontal cortex and or limbic system be an explanation for financial management issues? And our audience member is specifically referring to maybe contact sport athletes or soldiers that might experience that kind of damage.
Doc, have you seen anything in your practice? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll leave the financial implications to you and perhaps that discussion. But as far as frontal lobe injury or prefrontal cortex injury, we talked about some of the different functions that has: delayed gratification, reasoning, judgment, just sitting back and reflecting, planning. So if there's frontal lobe injury or prefrontal cortex injury, those functions can be damaged. So what that can lead to is impulsivity. People just doing whatever they want because they don't have that rider on the elephant, as you stated. They just go and do whatever they want. Like, oh, let's go gamble, or let's go get something great to eat. It doesn't matter, because that regulation that the prefrontal cortex has on the limbic system is not there. Conversely, sometimes personality is in the prefrontal area in the frontal cortex. So sometimes it can cause people to, be more flat, not have any emotion, not really care, not interact with their surroundings. They call it abulic, or apathy, just not caring, not interacting. So there are many different ways that, damage or injury could affect how you interact with the outside world and your judgments and reasoning. As far as football or soldiers, if there's any amount of damage from those, activities, certainly that could play a role, I would imagine. But what I'm referring to, those bigger type, more profound effects, are from more severe trauma, most typically.
Yeah, I would, it could be a cause. Determining causality is always extremely difficult. One of the other things that you would want to keep in mind is the fact that these the folks you've described, have had a series of experiences, oftentimes long, extended experiences, which become formative. What do I mean? Let's take, for example, a super successful athlete who is used to having folks cater to him or to her. They're used to sort of being the center of the orbit, and everything is given to them. So impulse control is not something that they have. In fact, if somebody were to tell them no, they would simply be removed from their orbit. So it becomes natural to sort of develop a habit, as it were, of impulsivity. That's another potential contributing factor. I'm not sure if it's causal. Soldiers who are dealing with a life and death situation may not be thinking long term, because they have been so conditioned to deal with short-term threats, which might be, threaten their survival, that again, long-term gratification deferral could be difficult. So there could be multiple levels to that.
Thanks. Our next question for Amanda. What are some of the most interesting questions or responses that you've gotten to some of the shows, and when you said you brought out your activities onto the floor, do those tend to be from kids or from adults?
Yeah, great question. So what's really great is that we have adults and kids that give feedback on our experiments, and so sometimes brutally honest kids also. So what's really neat about that is that when you're explaining really difficult concepts, or you have an idea of like, this will be a really great show, and you're doing it in real time, you understand what people are drawn to and what is actually able to be demonstrated in a live show. So, there's a very big difference between a PowerPoint presentation where you're giving a lecture versus we want you to participate and do an experiment and have fun. Some of the reactions that we've received are, this like, whoa, because, we do some really explosive things, really blow up balloons or play sound in fire. But I think the really key moments are, ones where you're not doing anything. I call it flim flam, like big and crazy, but those little things of we have these goggles that shift your vision like half a degree, and we throw frogs into a bucket, and you do it, without the goggles, and then you do it with the goggles. And, it shows how your perception is altered. And what is amazing is as you're doing that demo, people get better at it. And you're like, well, why? And it's like your brain is so amazing, and it's with its plasticity and just like learning new behaviors all the time that, they'll get better. And for the audience, that's a really aha moment of like, practice makes perfect. And this is why, you have to do things in a routine or in a lot of times, so that way you get better at it. So it's those like little aha moments, and sometimes they're, the big ooh and ah things, but the little things and of, just drawing a 6 will spark that and make the audience really excited.
Yes, thank you for making us be a little active tonight. All right. Our next question, and maybe our last one, I don't want to tempt Mother Nature too much to shut us down here tonight. But can you discuss meditation and its impact on the prefrontal cortex? Maybe how that might make you a better spender in any way.
Doc, I don't know if any research has been done on that in your area, but I know Dr. Haidt mentioned that as one of the more successful ways to help, as he said, manage or regulate the elephant. Remembering that the more, you mentioned the plasticity of the brain, this is perfect. The more you become habituated to specific types of responses, the more reactive and reflective it becomes. So if you're spending time meditating every morning, you're spending time sort of centering and grounding, and I don't have any other words for it than that. You're spending time doing that. You're going to sort of start living from a different place inside of yourself, a place that's a little more inner driven, a little less exteriorly oriented. What we do find is that people who have an inner locus of control tend to have more ability to self-regulate. This fosters that inner locus of control. So that might have something to do with it. I'm sure there's been a lot of research. That's about as far as I can go with it, though.
So I'll need to do yoga before Trader Joe's, I guess, now. All right. Well, thank you all. I think we answered the question. I was joking with our speakers beforehand of this is almost the start of a joke of what happens when a neurosurgeon, a financial advisor, and a science center rock star walk into a bar. And I think the answer is we have a lot of fun, and we our brains light up along the way. So thank you so much to all three of you for, again, sharing your insights and your expertise with us tonight. I will close us out with a few upcoming events. So next week, we have a virtual tour with the Andy Warhol Museum, and they'll be focusing on pop portraits. Have on September 12th, another art tour with Carnegie Museum of Art, our monthly member tour. And then, as Chris mentioned, we are joining forces again on September 7th to talk about charitable giving strategies. And we'll have another celebrity guest or two join us for that webinar as well. So I just want to give a shout out to all of our members in the audience and express our sincere gratitude, appreciation for being members, for your support and sticking with us, staying engaged through all the work that we do. We are just incredibly grateful to have you as part of the museum family. And to anyone who may not be a member but is in the audience tonight, I encourage you to reach out to us if you are interested in becoming a member. And we are also just incredibly grateful that you joined us here tonight to hear this incredibly interesting topic. And we hope to see you at the museums one way or another in the weeks ahead. So with that, I will send everyone back out to this very stormy evening, at least in Pittsburgh, and hope you enjoyed tonight's program and hope to see you on Zoom sometime soon. Bye, everyone.